Hi, my name is Macy Davis and I'm a children's librarian at the Public Library of Brookline. Today we're going to do a needlepoint craft for Women's History Month. And the first thing we're going to do is prepare all of the supplies that came in our kit. In your kit you will have received a sheet of templates, a piece of plastic canvas, yarn in 3 different colors, gray for a background and 2 colors for the design, as well as a needle. You will also need to complete your project a Sharpie and a pair of scissors. So if you need to pause the video and go get your supplies, now would be a great time to do so. The first thing we're going to do is prepare our plastic canvas. You may notice that your plastic canvas has a few rough edges, and you want all of the edges of your plastic canvas to be smooth, so I'm just going to cut off the teeth and the rough edge from this edge of my canvas. And then we're going to trace our design. You can just lay your canvas on top of the template and trace over it in Sharpie. And don't worry, the yarn will cover up all of your Sharpie marks by the time we get to the end of this project. And you're also going to cut a length of yarn from the first color you want to use. So I am using blue for the middle petal of my lotus flower, but you can use any of the colors that you want. And to thread your needle, I recommend twisting a little bit of the yarn together to make it a little bit stiffer to poke through the needle. And pull a long tail to hold on to while stitching. The first stitch we're going to learn is the back stitch. And here is a stitching guide in case you need to reference down to it. For a back stitch, the end of one stitch is also the beginning of another stitch, so they all come together smoothly. So to start, we're going to poke our needle through our starting hole. I'm starting at the bottom of my design. And then we're going to leave a tail, and all of our tails will be covered by other yarn during this project, so we don't have to tie any knots. Then we're going to pick a hole to stitch down through for our first stitch. For our second stitch, we're going to come up through the plastic canvas several holes away from our other stitch's end. And then we're going to go down through the same hole where our first stitch ended. So it's called a back stitch because we're going backwards on the fabric, or the plastic canvas in this case, as we create each stitch. The back stitch is the best stitch to use for curve because you can take smaller stitches and stitches of varying length as we go around the curves. If you picked a design that doesn't have as many round edges, you don't have to do a back stitch to outline your shape to start, because just the Continental Stitch will create flat edges for you. And the Continental Stitch is the next stitch that we're going to learn. The Continental Stitch is a diagonal stitch. So we'll be taking our stitches diagonally across holes and then vertically on the back. So please pause and use this stitching guide or come back to it at any point to see how the Continental Stitch works. So first I'm going to pull my tail up behind the back side of the canvas to make sure that I cover it as I'm stitching. It does work better if you have your tails horizontally rather than vertically, but they will get covered either way. So first I'm just going to pick a hole to come up through, and then I will go to the hole in the top right of that one. So I'm taking a stitch diagonally rather than vertically or horizontally. But my stitch on the back side to get to my next hole will be a vertical stitch down to the hole to the right of the one that I started in, and then another diagonal stitch up to the right. And that finishes my first row since it was a small row of 2 stitches. So to get to my next row, I'm actually going to stitch up further and take a weird long diagonal stitch on the back. And sometimes you have to do that depending on what the shape and length of your rows are. And so here I'm coming down vertically to the left, but you'll notice my stitches are still in the same direction as the stitches I took when I was coming to the right. And that's just because I'm filling this pattern from the bottom to the top rather than the top to the bottom, that sometimes I'm stitching down and sometimes I'm stitching up. It doesn't matter which direction necessarily you're taking stitches, as long as all of your stitches are going the same way. So mine are all slanting to the right. And this stitch, if you're doing a design with a flat edge, like perhaps the one of the books, this design will create the edges for you, and you don't have to outline those flat edges in backstitch if you don't want to. And now I'm just getting started on my third row, and I will keep going, working to cover my tails and covering the tails if I need to switch out for another piece of yarn, while I finish filling in the center of this blue lotus flower. And I'm going to do all of my lotus flower using a Continental Stitch, and then I'm tucking my tail in here through the other stitches, which is another option. You can always tuck your tail through existing stitches rather than waiting to cover it up. When moving on, after I finished all the colors on my design using a combination of backstitch and Continental Stitch, I just decided I wanted to trim my canvas down to make it more of a rectangle long ways rather than a rectangle vertically. And you're welcome to trim your canvas into any shape or any direction you want around your design. And now the best stitch to use for filling in the big space of the background is the Continental Stitch. And that's what I'm doing here with this gray yarn. It's just getting started on the lots of Continental stitching that I'll be doing. And you can see that I'm covering the tail as I stitch. And you will have to use a lot of yarn to do this. So when your tail gets too short, your yarn gets too short to stitch, you can cut a tail and keep going. And the third step we're going to learn is the whip stitch, and this is the stitch that will cover the edges. Here you can see a stitching diagram to come back to for reference. But for a whip stitch, we come up through a hole and then fold a tail, and then we come over the edge and into the next hole to the right. And so it's called a whip stitch because we're whipping over the edge and into the next hole. And this is what's going to create a nice smooth yarn covered edge rather than just the plastic canvas edge for our project. You certainly don't have to whip stitch to finish the edges, but I really like how it looks. And you can see that I'm being careful to go ahead and cover the tail here as I stitch. And whip stitching is pretty straightforward. It's just up and then into the next hole to the right or the left, depending on the next direction that you're moving. We are going to get to the corner here in a second, and when we get to the corner, I'm going to show you how you take 3 stitches in each hole to fully cover the corner, because you don't want that pointy corner to really poke out at you, so you have to be sure to cover it in yarn really well. And now you can see that I've arrived at the corner. And so I take my first whip stitch into the corner from the next stitch, like normal, and then I take a stitch that I'm only going to go through that hole and wrap it around and come back in the exact same hole. I'm not going to move to the next hole around the corner yet because I want one stitch dedicated just to covering the hole. And then I'm going to take my third stitch around the corner. When I get to the end and take my last stitch, I just have to use the needle to make space under previous stitches to tuck the yarn so that it doesn't get loose, and then I just cut it off. And there is our finished lotus flower for Women's History Month Needlepoint. Thanks so much for crafting with us, and we would love to see what you create.